Hi, everybody. So yesterday or last time we talked about organic versus inorganic compounds, and you can find both in living systems, and they both play important roles. And we mentioned some of the inorganic compounds like water and carbon dioxide and oxygen that are essential to living things. But now we're going to turn our attention to organic compounds, and there are four groups of organic compounds that are really important for us to learn. So remember, this is about classifying all the molecules that are out there. And we have one group that's inorganic and one group that's organic. Within the organic compounds, we're now going to subdivide that group into four groups. There are more in the world, but these are the four we're going to learn. So we have carbohydrates. You all have heard of carbs, right? If you're an athlete, you've got a carbo load the night before a big event, right? Because carbs have lots of energy. Some examples of carbs, right? When you carbo load would be, you'd have bagels or pasta, anything that has flour, wheat, right? Lots of carbs, but there's also in that group sugar. Yum, sugar, right? So sugars and flour and starch, all of that is carbohydrates. When you hear carbs, you should think energy. Your body goes to carbohydrates for energy. When you go to run, looking for carbs. Get those carbs, get running, okay? So for immediate use of energy, it's carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, you're gonna have to identify them. And one of the things that you can look for is that they're made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen and have twice as many hydrogen as oxygen. So if you count up the number of hydrogens and oxygens, there'll be twice as many hydrogens as oxygens, no more, no less. And it will have only C, H, and O, nothing else. We also have lipids. Lipids are fats. That's really what you should think of. Fats, oils, and waxes, but really you're thinking fat, okay? Now that's also about energy. There's a lot of calories in fat, right? There's a lot of energy stored in fat. That's what calories measure. They measure fat or energy. So there's a lot of energy in these lipids, but these are not what your body goes to when you run. These are the things when you've got extra energy to store, you put it on your body. Why? Because contrary to what you think, lipids, fats are actually really, really light. They're not dense. They have a lot of energy stored in them, but don't weigh a lot. That's why when we go to store energy that we have extra, we put it into lipids because that way we don't have to carry around as much weight. So they're not dense. If you were to carry that same amount of energy in carbohydrates, you'd weigh a lot more than carrying that same amount of energy as lipids. So it's for storing energy. Carbohydrates for when you want to go and use energy, lipids for when you want to store it. Lipids also have C, H, and O and nothing else, but they're the compounds that are not going to have twice as many H's as O. Could have more, could have less, but it's C, H, and O and not an exact 2-to-1 ratio of hydrogen to oxygen. We also have proteins. These do lots and lots of jobs. Mostly, you should think of building blocks and a special category of proteins called enzymes we'll talk about at the end of the chapter. Proteins, you can identify because they're not like carbohydrates and lipids. They've got an N in there. They've got nitrogen. So they're C, H, O, and N. As soon as you see that N, you should be thinking protein. The last group we won't talk about in this chapter. We're going to talk about later in the year. They're called nucleic acids, DNA, RNA, your genes, the way you keep information about how to make you. That's all in nucleic acids. But we won't be talking about them much this chapter at all. So we're going to start today with carbs. So let's start with carbs. Now remember, carbs are for energy. You want to run, you go to those carbs, right? So the night before a big meet, coach says, carbo load, eat lots of carbs, lots of starch. The names generally end in os or often end in os. And there are three kinds of carbohydrates. We're going to start with the simplest. They are called monosaccharide. Mono means one, and saccharide is the Greek word for sweet or sugar. Some of you may have heard of the chemical called saccharin. If you go to the diner and they've got the little thing of all the different packets of sugar, and there's the white sugar packet and the pink and the blue and the yellow, right? Well, the pink one is called saccharin. It was one of the first sugar substitutes because it's very, very sweet. It's so sweet, we say it's saccharin sweet. It's almost too sweet. Okay, so saccharide or saccharin means sweet, and this one has one ring, so it's called a monosaccharide. And it looks like that. And you will see, if you look here, there's a ring in the center, okay, a ring in the center with stuff hanging off of the C's in the ring, okay? So that is a monosaccharide. Some examples, and the most important one is glucose. Glucose right here. Fructose is another one ring carbohydrate. So it has one ring, it's called a monosaccharide. If we take two of those rings and hook them together, we are going to have a what saccharide? What prefix means two? So monosaccharide was one ring. A disaccharide means two rings. And you can see here, we've got one ring here attached to another ring, not two separate rings. They're actually hooked together through the middle here. We have two rings hooked together. That's a disaccharide. This is also a sugar. And the most common example is the one in table sugar. It's called sucrose. Sucrose is the stuff you have to spoon out of the little white crystals, and you spoon it and you put it in your coffee. That's sugar. That's sucrose. It's a disaccharide. So we have monosaccharide has one ring, disaccharide has two. And then if we put three or more together, what's the prefix meaning three or more or many? And that is a polysaccharide. Polysaccharides are going to have many, many, many rings. Like that, you have one ring and two rings and three rings, 4, 5. You can have hundreds of rings. There's many different kinds of polysaccharides. These are also generally for energy, although they have some other jobs too. So we have many rings. So let's say a plant has been making sugar. They make glucoses, single rings. Let's say a plant's been making glucose. Sunny out, it's been raining and then sunny, and now it's busy doing photosynthesis, and it makes a sugar, a single ring, a one monosaccharide. And then it makes another monosaccharide and another monosaccharide and another monosaccharide. Been a great day. Been building up sugar like crazy. You might want to store it. It might do that by hooking them together in long chains, and when it does that, it makes a compound called starch. That's something that we humans love to eat. We love starch. Take it out of a plant like a wheat plant and grind it up and make flour. And the flour, we make cookies and bread and all sorts of things, or we make pasta. That starch is the many, many, many monosaccharides that the plant hooked together to store the sugar. Now, we don't make our own sugar, but we eat sugar, right? Think Halloween, lots of sugar. I mean, you've been packing that stuff away, right? You've been eating sugar, eating sugar, eating sugar. And now you've got tons of sugar in your blood. That stuff's no good for you in huge amounts. So you're going to hook it together just like a plant, and you're going to take many of them and put them together in a slightly different way into a compound that's a lot like starch called glycogen. We store that in our liver, pack it away until we need it. We might break it down later, or we might eat starch and then break that down into sugar. Yes, when you eat starch and you digest it, you get sugar. That's why it's good for energy. But not all polysaccharides are for sugar for energy. Some are building blocks. Cell walls of plants. Plants have cell walls around the outside. They have many, many sugars hooked together into a polysaccharide, many rings together, called cellulose. And it builds the cell walls of plants and makes them stand up, right? So it's very rigid. And there's a similar thing in insects. Insects have a polysaccharide, many, many rings hooked together that can make something called chitin that makes the exoskeleton. So when you look at a grasshopper or another bug, it's got this shell on the outside. That's a carbohydrate. It's really sugars hooked together in a different way. So if you eat starch, you can digest it down into sugar and get the energy out of it. If you have glycogen and you break it down, you can get the sugar out of it. If you could digest insect exoskeletons, you would get sugar out of it. We don't have the chemicals that can do that, but if we could, it would, because the exoskeletons of insects Their shells are made of polysaccharides just like starch is. And so that is carbohydrates. We have monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. And remember, just to keep it clear, we have, of all compounds, we've got organic, inorganic. Out of the organic, we have carbs, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. Out of the carbs, we have monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. We will go on to lipids and proteins next time.